Oh, yeah. Wow. Mexican legend Juan Manuel Marquez, who famously knocked out Manny Pacquiao, I want to, says that Canelo Alvarez will never be the best from Mexico or the best that Mexico has ever produced. We're going to talk about that right now. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. Make sure you smash the like button. Also, subscribe to my channel. Listen, I don't know how you found my video, but somehow, some way, you made it. You arrived at the content. Please help others find the content by throwing a like on the video. It's a free, simple gesture. Takes a couple seconds, and it goes a long way. Now, Canelo Alvarez, payday. You want payday. I know that. He just defeated Caleb Plant to become undisputed champion. First ever Mexican fighter to have accomplished that. First ever super middleweight undisputed in the 4-belt era. Congratulations to Canelo Alvarez. Now, somebody who kept it real as far as their opinion, and who always has when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, is Juan Manuel Marquez. So I have it pulled up, link in the description. There's an interview. It says, without hesitation, legendary fighter Juan Manuel Marquez assured that Saul Canelo Alvarez, he will never be the best boxer in Mexican history. So he's saying, you know, Canelo's 50 plus fights into his career, and he's saying there's nothing he can do to become the best boxer ever produced, that Mexico ever produced. Says among the arguments of Marquez is that Canelo, he does not fight his rivals in equal circumstances. The Chupapi Muñeño's gonna be mad. In addition, Mexican boxing is enriching, and there have been great figures, which is why it is impossible that the Guadalajara can be, right? Says for Marquez, Canelo will never be the best Mexican in history. Quote, did not answer Juan Manuel Marquez in the interview that was published on YouTube when asked if Canelo could become the best boxer in the history in Mexico. And he explained his reasons. This is a translation, so there might be a couple of things that are probably loose and, you know, not grammatically correct. Says the interview came out before the most recent fight of Canelo. It says, quote, he said, you can't say that Canelo is the best in history and the best that we have seen. He says Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., for example, the fighters, he is among one of the fighters who have faced the best. He considered that just like he and other boxers who are world champions, they never benefited from situations like the rehydration clause. Wow. Or they did fights without being called the A side in the fight. Something that does happen with Canelo Alvarez in the vision or viewpoint of Marquez. Quote, there are many fighters who win world championships like I did and as several others did. Fighting with the best without having the rivals have rehydration clauses, without reducing them, and without telling them you have to do this and you have to do that. Now I am the A side. Says Canelo must fight under equal circumstances. For being considered the best pound for pound in the world and one of the boxing fighters that moves boxing today in recent years, he is considered to be the A side. It says in the contest before Sergey Kovalev, it was mentioned there was a rehydration clause and the Russian could not weigh more than 185 pounds the day of the fight. The same happened with Danny Jacobs and Rocky Fielding, that the day they stepped into the ring before Canelo, his rehydration should not be more than 10 pounds. Quote, it is plausible what he is doing economically. It is very good. But to put rehydration clauses on the fighters, for example, that the next day you don't have to gain so many pounds, that if you go up, you will have a fine. I think that is not fair for the fighter. Criticism of Marquez, it goes in the sense that you have to fight in equal circumstances. Thus, the fighter could really see where he occupies and if he deserves to be there. Quote, It must be done under equal circumstances to see what level I have reached as a fighter, to see if I am worthy where I am and defend where I am. Canelo Alvarez Saturday night became the first Mexican and Latin American to unify the division super middleweight by knocking out Caleb Plant in 11 rounds. Ooh. Now, this is very interesting because I got so many ways that I could break this down. We Unpack coming to you live. Now, this is very, very funny. And you see why I've been at the top of my game putting out boxing content on YouTube for this length of time. Because I am unbothered and undeterred in my efforts to, talk the sweet science unapologetically and speak to the core audience of people who want to learn boxing, who respect boxing, and who just want a fair shake and they want somebody who's going to keep it real. I'm your guy. Please subscribe. Now, the reason I said that is because when I say things that I've said about Canelo Alvarez, I'm the bad guy. I'm the Canelo hater. They say, like, people in the comment section say, oh, I hate Canelo. I've heard I'm biased. I've heard insults saying I'm racist because I've said these things about Canelo. Now, those same fans are now in a pickle because you have somebody who is from the same country as Canelo. He's of the same ethnicity and heritage as Canelo, albeit different parts, right? Different parts of Mexico. And he's literally saying what I've said on my videos. So I haven't heard one person say that Juan Manuel Marquez is racist for saying what he's saying. Now, some people will say, oh, he's a Canelo hater and he's a longtime hater. And that seems to be the stigma if you have any kind of criticism for Canelo. Either you're racist, some people will say, oh, you hate Mexicans, even though Canelo is one person. So that just goes to show that the ignorance of the fans who say that because you have a criticism, even though it's so many layers to this. Because for one, you have some fans who say, oh, this is boxing, keep race out of it. You're pulling the race card. Race doesn't matter. But then if you say something about Canelo that the Canelo man fans don't like, then they'll say you're against Canelo and a whole ethnicity of people because you have criticisms for one guy. So these things don't make sense. But now the walls are closing in because Juan Manuel Marquez, who's from Mexico, is saying the same thing. And I guarantee you those same fans who call me racist and other people, when they have a criticism or thoughts on Canelo that are perceived as negative, they won't call the legendary Mexican fighter Juan Manuel Marquez racist, but they'll say I am, right? So moving on. What Marquez is saying, he's maintained. In fact, this has been a long history of the two kind of in public going back and forth, and Canelo and Marquez, it doesn't look like they've always seen eye to eye. Marquez comes from the old school, real no nonsense trainer, Nacho Beristain, legendary trainer. He's actually my favorite trainer ever from Mexico, the Romanza gym. He's worked with Oscar de la Hoya at a point in his career. Of course, Juan Manuel Marquez. He's worked with Barrera. He's worked with Finito Lopez. I mean, he's a G. He's a legend in the game. He has a ton of fighters that he's worked with. He even worked with Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. at a point in time for a particular fight. So really much respects to Nacho Beristain. And the funny thing is, in a way, you have Canelo and Eddie Reynoso, and they're trying to make Eddie Reynoso the modern day Nacho Beristain as a trainer, right? And they're trying to make Canelo kind of the modern day Juan Manuel Marquez, but there's some marked differences. There's some marked differences because just like Marquez is saying, Marquez had it the hard way. And a lot of fighters from yesteryear, like throwback classic fighters, this is the case. They didn't have any easy fights. They didn't have I'm not gonna say no easy fights, like where it was like a tune-up fight or whatever, but their schedule was pretty tough. If you look at Juan Manuel Marquez, he fought Mike Alvarado. He had 4 fights with Manny Pacquiao. I mean, just that alone, to be honest, when we're talking about Canelo, there's nobody that Canelo has faced ever that is very comparable to Marquez and Pacquiao having 4 fights. So what I mean is this: no rehydration clauses or gimmicks or quick turnarounds from fights, and you had a certified threat in front of you that was very detrimental to your style of fight. You know, everybody in boxing says styles makes fights, which is true. Styles make fights. And Marquez and Pacquiao, their styles gelled well in terms of every time they fought, they pushed each other to the brink, and it was explosive outcome that people paid to watch, and it was like must-see TV. And what Pacquiao does well was a kryptonite for Marquez, and what Marquez did well was a kryptonite for Pacquiao. That's why it's a match made in heaven, because again, styles make fights. I cannot think of anybody that Canelo has fought repeatedly under that type of duress, where Canelo Alvarez is consistently like just basically 4 fights where there were no gimmicks, no rehydration clauses, no quick turnarounds, no failed negotiations, and then they got the negotiations together last minute, nothing like that. And this is kind of what Marquez is talking about. Basically, and it's not just Canelo. In all fairness, it's not just Canelo. There's a lot of people, and they're nothing like, it's almost like, here's an example. It's like, for my basketball fans, it's like the NBA now versus the NBA back in the day. The NBA, it still gets great ratings, and it could even maybe get more ratings than it's ever gotten. However, the physicality of the game, both in the NBA and the NFL, has changed over the years. Different styles of refereeing and, you know, different things are tolerated. If you played in Michael Jordan's era, like in the 90s, you were in for very physical games, like Chicago Bulls versus the New York Knicks. There's bad blood. Of course, Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls and the bad boy Piston team with Isaiah, right? These are Rodman. You know, these are real nasty games. You could get punched, pushed, mushed, elbowed, thrown around. Like, these are super physical. And comparatively speaking, boxing has probably become more watered down than the OG fighters of yesteryear, right? And that's kind of why I think Marquez is always going to not see eye to eye with Canelo Alvarez, because when he was coming up, it wasn't no moving like this. It wasn't like, oh, I'm the A side, so this and that, and I'm going to enforce this upon you. It was like, you got to fight, and you got to fight. And I think maybe some of the other fighters possibly resent that angle, that they risk their lives just the same thing as modern fighters are risking their lives. But at the end of the day, we live in a different age and social media age, so it is what it is. So, you know, Canelo's taking the risk and he's beating the guys that he's beating, but there's also a high level of strategy to what Canelo's doing. And Marquez touched on it. I've definitely touched on it many a times on my channel in the boxing game. And it's just, it is what it is. I give props for the Caleb Plant fight because I thought it was a difficult fight. In my opinion, Caleb Plant was a guy who had the tools to beat Canelo. And I even picked Caleb Plant to win a majority decision, and Canelo beat him. So I do give him props for that particular win. But you look at before, this is the gamesmanship and the strategy that Marquez is talking about. Canelo Alvarez doing things like rehydration clauses with Danny Jacobs and Rocky Fielding. Kovalev was coming off a grueling fight where he was almost knocked out by Anthony Yard. And he was supposed to, before going into the Yard fight, he was in negotiations with Canelo Alvarez. And Canelo's team or whatever the situation, they didn't want to pay Kovalev what he was asking for at the time. So the negotiations, they were too strung out and it took too long. So Kovalev, as a champion at that time, he had to fight his mandatory Anthony Yarde because he couldn't get the Canelo fight over the line. So what happened is Kovalev fought his mandatory and he almost didn't make it out of that fight with his belt because Anthony Yarde, who had never faced that level of talent and later lost to a guy like Lyndon Arthur, who's really kind of a domestic level fighter, right? That's the guy almost stopped Kovalev, and this was his first real step up, right? And then Canelo does what Canelo does, and he picks up the Kovalev fight, and Kovalev looks nothing like we've ever seen him in this fight. To me, that fight, something was off with it. It was FAF. I refuse to believe anybody who tells me that that fight was contested on the up and up. I refuse, because we've seen, I was at Kovalev Ward, Andre Ward 1 and Andre Ward 2, both of those Ward Kovalev fights. I went to both of them, and that was not the same caliber man. So either he was washed up, or the quick turnaround, or rehydrated, something was not cracking. So it's not the same quality win, you know, even though he knocked him out, and you could say whatever. So in that regard, Canelo has a lot of victories that are, like Marquez is saying, they are fabricated or really kind of embellished. They look good on paper, but then when you look at the minute and fine details, you get to see what it really is. Like Kovalev was a champion, but like I said, he almost lost his fight right before that. He had gotten stopped by Andre Ward already, and he had gotten stopped by Eleider Alvarez already. So this is what Canelo's team frequently likes to do. You know, even with the Caleb Plant fight, they had negotiations to fight in September that they were trying to get the fight off for, because Canelo said he won the Mexican dates. But for some mysterious reason, the negotiations fell apart. Then Canelo was allegedly in talks to fight Dimitri Bivol, and then he came back to the table with Al Heyman and PBC and said he wanted to fight Caleb Plant. So this is more examples of how come it's always some like failed negotiation or strung out negotiate. Like, why didn't Canelo fight Caleb Plant in September? These are all like weird. When I've always learned this, if something continues to happen, at some point is no longer a coincidence. So Caleb Plant fought in January, I think it was, and he could have fought Canelo in September. Canelo said he wanted the Mexican dates, but then in the last 3-4 years, he's failed several Mexican dates. One because he failed a drug test with clenbuterol. Another was because of the pandemic. There was a couple of them on September Mexican Independence Day weekend, and he couldn't compete because his team couldn't get those fights off. Caleb Plant was one of them. There was another time with Kovalev, as I'm mentioning, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the things that I'm talking about. Caleb Plant fought in January, and he could have fought in September, which is more activity, which is better. You know, we're already in a pandemic, fighting one time. Meanwhile, Canelo, this is what he likes to do. He wants to set himself up for the victory. So Canelo was very, very active. Tyson Fury just did an interview about this, and he said inactivity is no good. And he's a skilled fighter. He says inactivity is no good. I'm just paraphrasing. Inactivity is no good. If you got one guy who's sitting on the couch and then another guy who's active, that's no good. Go check it out. It's a recent Tyson Fury interview. And this is coming from a guy who has some boxing skills, right? And some pizzazz when it comes to boxing. So that's what Canelo likes to do these games. Caleb Plant, he should have fought him in September. And at least instead of a 10, 11 month inactivity for Caleb Plant, it would have been less than that, you know, because September is the 9th month of the year. So it would have been just a little bit shorter. Meanwhile, in the in-between time, in the meantime, Canelo was staying active. He fought Caleb Smith in December. Then he fought Yildirim in February. And then he fought Billy Joe Saunders in May. So he got 3 fights in 11 months. And then Caleb Plant got 1 fight in 10 months. And Caleb Plant was doing very well for himself. But ultimately, he got caught. He got caught lacking. Canelo seized the moment and that he threaded the needle. So these are the kind of things. I just want to know when Canelo will fight somebody where there's really no stipulations, no rehydration clause, no failed negotiations associated with that fight, etc. Like, let's say David Benavidez wins on Saturday. David Benavidez tonight, he destroys Kyron Davis or whatnot, right? Can they agree in January to fight for May? No games. David Benavidez and Canelo Alvarez, no games, full training camp for both fights. So Canelo's going to continue to get these types of criticism. I've already put you on I put the dogs on the scent. So you guys are my bloodhounds. I put the content out. I give you talking points and what I see in the game. And it's up to you guys to observe it. So we'll see. We'll see. Right now, Canelo, he did great numbers. So that's what people are focused on. But Marquez he's cooking. He's making some true points. Because at the end of the day, Canelo does have this type of gamesmanship where if you look at the fine detail, it's like Canelo, his career is almost like one of those offers that look great. And then it says redefine print. And then when you read the fine print for this credit card that you're applying for, you see like, oh, the late payment fee is $59 and there's a over the limit fee and there's an annual fee associated with the credit card. And then the APR is subject to change based on the prime rate, and you don't have a fixed APR, things like that. That's how Canelo's wins are. It's like there's a lot of fine print where it looks great and it looks good. Like, oh man, he knocked out Kovalev. But then you look at the details. He didn't really look that great in the fight. Kovalev's coming off a quick turnaround, like I said earlier in this video, etc. And that's kind of what Marquez is talking about. So he's saying it's hard for him to be the best because legends like Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., he just had a fight who he had to fight. Like he had to fight prime Pernell Whitaker. Even though you could have said he was the A side and all that, he didn't do all that. He just fought. Even though he didn't win that fight, he fought him on the up and up. He fought Oscar De La Hoya on the up and up, etc., right? So that's what Marquez is referring to. Until Canelo stops with this, he's going to always have this stigma until he stops with the stipulations. And Marquez is just from the old school. He's a throwback fighter. So he's like, I'm not going to accept that. Again, it's like the NBA analogy that I said earlier. Is like you played the 95 Chicago Bulls and then you're trying to compare some of these NBA guys today. The league is different. You can't elbow somebody and the games, there's not as much roughhousing. For 1 minute people were flopping. It's just different. Same thing with the NFL. Imagine playing the Oakland Raiders in the 80s or the 1976 Steelers or the 90s 49ers. It's a different game than the NFL. You'll get all types of penalties and flags in the NFL now, roughing the passer and stuff that they probably weren't calling. So Canelo, if he wants to be revered, it's kind of a cultural thing. If he wants to be revered, then people already feel he's like a prima donna. You know what I mean? So the only way to get from around that is to stop doing so much of the A-side things. And I know some people are going to bring up Floyd. Floyd is Floyd, and he's done what he's done. And that's the weakest argument, because the funny thing is a lot of these racist fans that like Canelo, they hated Floyd. They hated Floyd, and then they blamed him, said he was a cherry picker and stuff like that. But then they'll use an excuse and say, oh, Floyd taught Canelo this and Canelo's just doing what Floyd did. No. When Floyd was here, you criticized him for these moves. So how can you accept it when Canelo's doing the A-side stuff and he doing the overkill? And real talk, Floyd Mayweather didn't do all this. He didn't fight Cotto at a catch weight. He didn't fight Cotto off a quick turnaround. He didn't fight Cotto off of a weak performance. He fought Cotto after he avenged his first loss with a guy who probably cheated him in the first fight, and that was the Antonio Margarito. He fought Shane Mosley coming off of the best win of his recent career, you know, against Antonio Margarito, where he stopped Margarito violently in LA, I believe at the Staples Center. So what are we talking about? Canelo doesn't do that. Canelo doesn't typically fight people coming off of their best wins like that. Even Caleb Plant. Look at Caleb. Just look at the history. The history will show you what Marquez and Ego are talking about. Caleb Plant is a good fighter. I believe he has skills, but he was coming off the Truax performance. A lot of people said that the Truax, they expected more from Caleb. So just look at historically, Canelo continues to fight and keeps fighting. It's like he's looking for that aha moment. And when you have a vulnerable performance, then that's when he maybe he sees something he feels he can exploit, or sees that you're beatable. Then that's when he does it. Caleb Truax, that was the Caleb Plant performance. You had Billy Joe Saunders, who fought on the KSI Logan Paul card against Corceres, and he didn't even look good in that fight. And then Canelo fights him a little bit after that, right? Or stretching guys out on long layoffs, or guys like Kovalev, like I keep telling you. Sergey Kovalev was coming off the yard fight where he almost got stopped. This is historically when Canelo fought El Perro Angulo was coming off of a loss, right? So history shows that Canelo continues to fight guys when they are coming off performances, not their best career performances, but performances where some people question who won or said you should have looked better, etc. So David Benavidez, if he puts on a monster performance and looks like a killer, then I don't look for Canelo to fight him in May. But then Charlo fought Montiel, and some people thought he looked vulnerable or winded and stuff like that. So I can really see the Charlo fight all of a sudden now being on Canelo's radar, because this is how he moves, right? Charlo been calling him out for years, and when he beat Sergey Derevyanchenko, it didn't look like the Canelo fight was on the table, but then he had the tough fight with Montiel. So now, after getting this one in the can with Showtime, now maybe Canelo Alvarez will pick Charlo. And if Benavidez looks like sensational, then he probably won't pick him. That's what it is. Let me know if you agree with myself and what Juan Manuel Marquez said. Let me know. Subscribe to the channel. I'm the best in the business. That's all I gotta say. We unpack. Are you tired of your YouTube videos not getting any views? Well, consider TubeBuddy. I've used TubeBuddy for years to scale up my YouTube channel. Now we're sitting over 200,000 subscribers. TubeBuddy is a browser extension that offers a ton of built-in productivity and time-saving services to take your channel to the next level. Use my link in the description to get started with TubeBuddy and level up your channel faster. We working.